annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I'm Jamie Machik with the Nicolay Federated Library System. And we had 5 sessions yesterday. We have 5 today. We had 2 great ones already this morning. We have people tweeting out there. I think we have Jean and Joy, Bradley and Leah are on the moderating the feed today, which is great. I wanted to mention those of you who have watched several of these sessions are probably getting a little tired of the pre-show announcements. Well, I had to create all 10 of these, and I have to closely watch all 10 of these. So no one is more tired of these than I am. So all joking aside, our next presenter is Daniel W. Rasmus. And Daniel is based in Washington, and he is a Seahawks fan, ladies and gentlemen. I know. I told him we wouldn't throw him out the room. It's okay. He was a keynote presenter at the Association of Rural and Small Libraries Conference that I attended in September. He also spoke at the Wills World Conference last summer. And I remember during that presentation that he described himself as an anti-futurist because he isn't about to predict what the future holds for libraries. He has some ideas. I think we all have some ideas. We know of some possibilities, but it's very hard to predict what's going to happen. And he's going to share more thoughts on all of this. So, Dan, whenever you are ready.
Well, thank you very much, and I take it everyone can still hear me, and that's all good. So thanks, and it's you know, football is what football is, and the least that you can say about that was it was one of the great games of all time, regardless of who won. So my tweet after that was that was the greatest moment since the 1988 home run hit by Kirk Gibson in the first game of the World Series, and I'm also a Dodgers fan, so. You know, I understand championships that get away, and the Dodgers have had plenty of those since 1988 because my pin from then is still valid. So anyway, here's a little bit of background about me. I am currently a member of the Faculty Academy at Pinchot University. I also do my own company, which is Serious Insights, and I'm the author of multiple books. And I've written all these nonfiction books, but I have to say one of the most exciting things is that I had my poetry book go up on only Kindle, but it's still 30-some years of my poetry published in various journals around the country, and it's now collected with some new stuff in Sketches of Spain and Other Poems, and that's up on Kindle. So enough about me, and let's go on to libraries. So this is kind of a ransom note from the future, and it's a warning, which is how we think about the future is dangerous, and that is in talking about and referencing that we often think in a linear way. And so when somebody stands in front of us and asks this question, and I apologize that I don't have a female version of this as well, but that's where clip art is these days. How will libraries work in 2024 or 2025 now? We create what I call myths of the future. So we have all of these things that we're not quite sure how they're going to turn out. You know, we don't know what, you know, when we look at, you know, Kindles, for example, we don't understand, is that really going to be how books are put together in the future, and what's the distribution model, and what's going to happen with publishers. And so as we reason through all of these things on our own, when somebody of authority asks us this question, and of course, you know, being smart, credentialed people, we kind of feel an obligation to think about the future in a robust way. We start writing these stories, and all of our uncertainties collapse into a narrative. And it ends up being a story because most people are not trained to think about the future as a set of possibilities, and they don't have the tools to do that. So after this presentation today, I'm going to give you some tools that are going to help you move in that direction, and would love to work with you as I do with other institutions in helping shape that if possible. So, you know, then you go, Dan, but you know, if I was just a little smarter, if I had just a little more data, I could probably predict the future. But you can't. So here's some examples of people who are smart and have plenty of money. You know, the phonograph is of no commercial value, says Thomas Edison. There is no reason for any individual to have a computer in their home, says the late Ken Olsen of Digital Equipment Corporation. No woman in my time will be Prime Minister, Chancellor, Foreign Secretary, not the top jobs anyway. I wouldn't want to be Prime Minister. You have to give yourself 100%, said Margaret Thatcher 10 years before she became Prime Minister. And then by 2000, machines will be producing so much that everyone in the U.S. will, in effect, be independently wealthy. With government benefits, even non-working families will have an annual income of $30,000 to $40,000, was predicted in Times Magazine in 1966. And then we see by the year 2000, people work no more than 4 days a week and less than 8 hours a day with legal holidays and long vacations. This could result in an annual working period of 147 days worked and 218 days off, said in October of 19th of 1967. So I hope you're all enjoying your time off, and we appreciate you joining us today. But this was said by Herman Kahn, who was actually a scenario planner, thought about the future in a robust way, but it's why I kind of have to tell myself I'm an anti-futurist, because it's very easy for people like Herman Kahn, whose job was to think about what Russia was doing in the Cold War and what was happening with nuclear arsenals. That was his job. But somebody asked him about tourism and what it was going to look like, what the world was going to look like in 2000. He said tourism is going to be the thing, right? So he slipped off of his, I'm not sure what the future is going to look like, and went into this mode of, I'm going to tell you, right? And I think William Gibson is also has a perspective where he says, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So if you don't yet have an iPad or an iPhone or some kind of smartphone, or if you don't have a smart TV yet or a curved screen TV, as I saw when I was at CES last week, your life is slightly different than those people who do. If you are not on social media, and your life is slightly different than those people who are on social media. So there are things about the future that have already arrived, and for people who are on the really bleeding edge of technology and or social change, their future is even more significantly different, because we may not even be aware of the things that they're using yet. And so there are these multiple waves and curves that overlap in the present. One of the things we're seeing, and it's very related to library science, is journals, and we're seeing this movement toward journals being less arbitrated and less peer-reviewed. Although there are still a number of them, there's lots of discussions in the world of publishing about, do we get to the point that science is much more open, and this is a book called Reinventing Discovery that's all about it. But I think the other important thing is that this helps us, this paragraph here, more generally, the attention of the right expert at the right time is often the single most valuable resource one can have in a creative problem solving. Expert attention is to creative problem solving what water is to life in the desert, its fundamental scarce resource. Now, as you'll see, there's, I think, a contrast between having a conversation about the future of libraries and the future of librarians. And I think this speaks to some of the issues around the future of librarians, because in some of the recent work that I've done with the University of Georgia, we actually have a future in which intelligent pattern recognition software has pushback. And there's a reassertion of human minds in sorting through and making sense of information. And so I think there's things here that we need to consider. Also, one of my favorite scenes in movies of all time is the NYU professor pontificating in front of Woody Allen standing in line in Annie Hall, and he's talking about Marshall McLuhan, and Woody Allen goes, oh, I've got Marshall McLuhan right here. So he brings him in, and Marshall McLuhan has said about technology, we become what we behold, we shape our tools, and our tools shape us. So one of the things that I've learned in decades of working in the technology industry is that the inventors of technology are often very poor at predicting what people are going to eventually do with their technology. And I think that's true of Steve Jobs as much as Bill Gates or anyone else, that there's a certain expectation that they have, an idea for what they're going to use the technology for, but because they've created open platforms with ecosystems of people who can create peripherals and new software, that there is a plethora of things that computers do today, being very general purpose, that were not imagined by their inventors. And in the work that I do, everything is about uncertainty. So I try to get people to recognize, if you take nothing else away from today's presentation, think about uncertainty and really grappling with that and understanding the things that you can't know. And so we'll go through a few of those from the library side in a moment, but this will give you a sense of, there's lots of things that we're uncertain about. We're uncertain about the future of employment, where we have underemployment in the United States. It's resurging, but it's not, even though the numbers are close, it's not the same jobs that were pre-recession. We don't know what's happening with Europe, and there's still concerns about Greece and Portugal and other places in Europe. And then with the healthcare, we don't know if healthcare is going to pass, and so there was a lot of waiting and kind of designing around does it pass or doesn't it pass, and now that it's passed, there's a whole lot of how do we implement it, plus it might get repealed, and so how much farther down the road of implementation do we go if it's going to be repealed, and if it's not repealed, is it going to be changed, and all of this stuff that just leads to everybody in human resources going, I have no idea what to do. And so we're all making do, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. And those are things that are very near to home. And so one of the things that scenario planning wants to do is get you to think outside of the realm of your particular area of expertise, your area of control, and think about the things in the world that are shifting, that are going to influence what you do on a day-to-day basis. So in library world, one of those is how will we access information. So we have here multiple ways of accessing information from a technology standpoint, big wide screens that people can walk up to, and I particularly point out the young man with the earpiece, because we now have earpieces and CPUs that are small enough that you can get self-contained, or we will be able to have self-contained voice-activated devices that fit in your ear. And so imagine, instead of going to Audible and downloading your book and listening to it on your smartphone or your tablet, that you can actually just have your earpiece in your thing and say, read me Act 2 of Shakespeare, of King Lear, and your earpiece will go out, find the piece of literature, and read you Act 2 of King Lear, or any other chapter of any other book. So if you think about that as a shift, we don't know, right? And that certainly begs questions about how would you put that technology into your stack. Does Overdrive do it? Is it something that you end up with yet another third-party distributor that you have to integrate? And my sense is this is really driving libraries to shift away from kind of their fundamental focus of providing answers and access to information to being technology architects, because the technology is changing so often. Excuse me, libraries are spending more money than I think they should be, and it's not that you're making a bad choice, but it's just because the technology is taking away from the access to the information side of it versus the technology architecture, right, and keeping up with what technologies are there. So then we go from the how do we access it to how do we represent it, and we've seen over the course of time that we've gone to cuneiform on clay tablets, to scrolls and parchment and papyrus, and then various forms of PDFs and HTML and Kindles and other things. And I'll come back to the Kindle at the end, because I've done a couple of workshops where we've rethought what could be inside of a Kindle, and I'll share that with you. Is the library location going to be centralized and virtual, meaning that if it becomes all information access through digital means, do we need the libraries in the field, regardless of if we're talking about public libraries or educational institutions? And if I'm now all mobile, why do I have to go someplace? I can get online, somebody there can find me the information, download it to my device, and I'm ready to roll. Or is the library going to be decentralized and local, where it's about high touch and having interactions and building relationships both with people and with information? Again, these are the edges of the uncertainties, and so I'm giving you a contrast of where things could go. Licensing approach, fragmented and independent. Are you going to go out and every library or smaller consortium managing their various licensing with all the different publishers, or are you going to get to the point that it's centralized and unified, and that we've decided that the buying power of all libraries is better than the buying power of distributed libraries, and that with Amazon's near monopoly on some of the content distribution and other sources, that it makes sense to have something of equal weight to the distributor, and that would be a more centralized approach to licensing. And then there's the question I've already talked about, a couple of examples of online between the distributed library, the centralized library distributing things and talking on your earpiece. But think about now we're at 128 gigabytes of information being held on a single micro SD card. And so this is something smaller than the tip of your finger. And the prices have gone down, so 128 gigabytes is now less than a couple $100. You can get 64 gigabytes for $30-some now. And so you can literally, and I'm sitting in a room with a credenza full of leather books. I am sitting in a room with 19 feet of book space, 6 feet tall across 19 feet, plus some other auxiliary bookcases, so I'm a big fan of books. But I could fit this entire room onto one of those and have plenty of room for some movies, right? And so that's a reality. It's really not an uncertainty. It's the real question is how much not can one person carry, but will they be willing to carry when we get into that kind of future. And of course there are different interaction models and reasons that you want paper, and there are studies coming out saying that the blue light from tablets is a really bad thing for your melatonin levels as you go to sleep, and so there's pushback as we learn more and more about how technology interacts with biology. But at the very practical level of space and portability, is that something that people do? And then we have the market position, and it's particular to, I think, public libraries, but also could be for various educational institutions as well. Are there things that people don't generally have access to and that you want to curate and make people aware of, and so making the library more of a boutique, a small press and local experience, or does it become just general information? It's interesting. I visited our library here in Sammamish, Washington, and I was preparing for these presentations, and they've actually stopped having shelves that look like this because their primary competitor is the Starbucks across the street. Their research has shown that people don't like to be overwhelmed by too much information, and so they've gone out of their way to reduce their stacks so that there's space on the shelves that gives people more of a browsing atmosphere. And so they've actually thought about their market position, and it's not a competition with half-price books. It's not a competition with the University of Washington Academic Library. It's a competition with, do people come here or do they go to the Starbucks across the street? And so they've made themselves a third place where they have a fireplace and a view and free Wi-Fi and meeting rooms and things like that. And so the question is then, what's the charter of the library that we have to think about in all of this? Do we have the budget? I mentioned already about technology and infrastructure. I think there are issues that need to be had about budget and how much of the budget goes to technology. Search is very interesting because if you go into the technology of what we're now seeing with machine learning and what's called deep learning, where machines are going in and kind of ruminating on patterns. They're not just picking up the fluff off the top, but they're actually going in and finding deeper and deeper relationships between content. Is that something where the original concept of the semantic web was the web was going to get smarter because we were going to curate information. We were going to do library-like things to it. We were going to put metadata on it. We were going to put references. We were going to put links. We were going to put tags in it so that the engines could find the relationships by us explicitly doing that. And that may be something that's going away, right? We may be seeing that disappear in favor of stuff finding me, right? Pattern recognition and more artificial intelligence approaches. And again, I think that shifts the, if I don't even have transparency into what technology is providing to potential consumers of library information, how do I compete with that, right? So if I'm doing kind of old-fashioned metadata about stuff and the machines have figured out a different, perhaps even better, more accurate, faster way, where are we with tagging and coding, and is that a profitable use of our funds still in terms of both organizing our information and providing access to customers? I thought this was interesting, and I've done this now for 3 years. This is the view of Google search for the year, what the big things were. 2013 was very bad for literature. There was absolutely nothing at all that had anything to do with anything that you could even find in a library. I mean, of course, you could find references to some of this in magazines, but would you go to a library to check any of this out? Would you go to a library to to do deep research? There wasn't anything that was kind of beyond the moment. In 2012, we had a little bit of stuff. We had Diablo 3, which you might be able to check out from a library. And then this year, and then you had the Hunger Games, so there was actually a book. May have been a movie, but it was also a book. And so there was something that was being searched for that you could actually go to the library and see physically there. This year it was a little different. We had a couple things. Of course, there was Flappy Bird, which was the #1 technology thing. You could go do research about Ebola. It's not something that, even though it is of the moment, it's not something that is exclusively of the moment. And then we have Frozen. So both in the United States and globally, Frozen is a book. So, the interesting thing here, though, is that the kinds of things that we think about people going to a library for are not the kinds of things that they search for on Google, at least not the top things that they search for.
Excuse me, Dan.
Yes.
Are you still supposed to be on the slide with the $100 bill?
I am not.
Okay. Because we're just seeing that.
Oh, okay. I am way past the $100 bill. Did it shift now? Did it change?
No.
I can try to leave in the presentation and come back in. Let's see if that works.
Okay.
Okay. And I take it you're not seeing my screen now?
I still see the screen, but not but I still see budget to retool.
Okay.
Let me.
Attendees still on hold. Currently, staff can participate in the conference call to begin speaking the entire audience. I have a start broadcast button. It says attendees are on hold. I don't know where that came from. I'm going to hit start broadcast and see what that does. Did a button get pushed that shouldn't have been?
No, let me try. Okay, now I'm going to make you the presenter again. Please hold tight, people, while we work this out. Okay, I'm giving you the screen back.
Okay.
There. Now yeah, we see you now, and it looks like it's good.
Okay.
So you just have to enlarge it.
Okay. All right. So now you can see the table?
Yes, thank you.
So that's the table. I'm not going to go backward, and because I talked through the other stuff, I want to be aware of the time, and I apologize for that. Anyway, so this is the table of the search stuff, and you can look at it. We'll get you the slides after the conference. So here's the question of, what do we hire the library for? So I worked with Clayton Christensen. We've chatted about this, and he has a very interesting thing in his innovation work where he's very negative on customer segmentation and likes to ask the question in an anthropomorphic way of what you hire an institution to do. So one of his examples was Cold Stone Creamery. And they did customer segmentation, and they had soccer dads. And soccer dads took their kids to soccer games, and then afterwards they bought them ice cream. And so this was an evening activity. But they had this weird thing happening in the mornings where they were selling milkshakes. And they couldn't figure that out because there was no customer segment that bought milkshakes in the morning. And what they realized was this was the soccer dads who had really two personas. They had the soccer dad persona in the afternoon, and they had the I'm commuting to work for over an hour and I need a companion in my car. And so they actually, after recognizing that, and made their milkshakes even richer and thicker, because what they wanted was somebody, if you buy coffee in the morning, you drink your coffee, and when it's gone, if you're on an hour commute, you're stuck. You either have to pull over and get more coffee, or you're just bored and you're trying to stay awake for the rest of your commute. If you have a thick, rich milkshake, that can last you an hour. because it's hard to get it going, right? And so it takes a little while to thaw out, and it takes you a while to get to the bottom of the cup. And so their customer segmentation proved wrong. And so we have to think about, who are all the audiences that we're serving, and think about them in a complex way, but also ask the question of what do they think they're hiring the library for, right? Are they hiring the library for being a place that you can get free internet and access to computer terminals, or are they looking at it as a place to get books? And those questions may sound like they're, of course it's both, but for different populations of people, it may not be both, right? And so really understanding where the customer is, and I think right now we don't understand where the transition of the customers are, the consumers and the patrons of the library. We don't understand where they're going in the future, and I think that's where the uncertainty comes in. And then we have the possible future. So I did a bunch of research, and I have a great big mind map that I did, and this is a extrapolation of that on some of the key points. And interestingly, these are things that libraries are considering to become, or already have as part of their charter. And this is really a strategic level question about the mission of the library. Is it just a public space that happens to have books in it? And that's really where all of these other things come into play, right? These are the things that people have suggested libraries could do to drive interaction and engagement and get people to come into the libraries. And we've always had reading time and certain other things, but this is really thinking about it as a community center, right? So places where there's speakers and health and safety lectures and job preparation and computer labs, and you hold elections and put ballots, polling places in there, and you have a post office, and you can have games, and it's the place, as I mentioned, the third place where you come. Answer Hub is probably much more of a traditional thing, and that I think is something that, again, as we look at the future and some of the bigger uncertainties around the efficacy of the Internet, and does it actually always make sense to both trust the information that's on the Internet and to believe that that it's the exhaustive source. Do libraries and human intermediation with information start re-emerging? Again, we don't know how that's going to play out. Is it about preservation or access or something else? So this is akin to the what do we hire it for, but if we think about the individual charters within the libraries, my library has no historical collection. It has almost no reference books. There's a World Book Encyclopedia set on a shelf that's essentially, kind of a, we have one of these, and it's look at that, but when was it last updated, and who uses it, in the world of Wikipedia, and what are the other things? What, if we think about the charter, what does the library do? And then I think that's contrasting very much with the idea of, the librarian, where I think there's a lot of things that, again, in this information-rich world that where we're relying increasingly on machines to provide us answers, there's a lot of things where librarians can step in, both from the intermediation standpoint of being able to make sense of information for people, but also potentially to have jobs at companies like Google and Facebook and other places where those skills are needed, right? And so, how do we measure the performance of learning, and think about when I do strategic work with libraries and with education, one of the questions is what's the value? And of course, as a public good, we're not supposed to ask those questions, but people do when they're sitting on city councils and county councils and having a conversation about where do we put our money. They ask those questions, and so understanding, what the value is back, and I think that's a big 21st century problem of understanding knowledge and the role that various knowledge institutions play in local economies. I think we've got a lot of work to be done there. We mentioned information consultants, curation, developer of standards, so if there are things that we end up with in terms of tagging, or do the libraries take a lead role in that, librarians take a lead role in that. Program development, do you become a social media celebrity where you're the key tweeter of, these are the new books that we have to see, and I write for a property called Pop Matters where I write book reviews, and I know there are some librarians that do that, but does your library and do your staff members actually create a buzz locally, or even bigger than that, around your opinions and perspectives on what to read and what's good and what's not. Teachers and trainers, taxonomy, experience design, etc. So there are lots of things, I think, and we're uncertain about what's your job description as a librarian going to look like in a decade. How do we represent knowledge? And so we've talked about how we kind of code it into books and what's the way that it's displayed to us. But then there's the whole idea of how do we actually put it together, right? So these are typically linear narratives with bullet points occasionally and a couple of pictures in there, but books are books. And the semantic web people have whole different ideas. And so this is a topic map that's a knowledge representation of knowledge representation systems. And so I won't get into the details of what OIL or RDF or DAML are, but they are ways of representing knowledge, and do we get to the point that books start to look like that? The relationship with publishers, mentioned that a little bit earlier, but do we end up paying more and just kind of going, okay, this is how it works? Because I'm always fascinated when I go to read an older book on from my library, and there's 20 copies and they're all checked out. The electronic versions are all checked out. I'm going, really? Is that is that driving me to be put in line, or does it drive me to BitTorrent to go find a PDF of the same book and not even worry about it anymore? And I think the publishers are missing that. Or again, in that idea of consortium, do the libraries start walking away from the publishers and going, this model is broken and you're not negotiating in good faith, and we have to rethink how we do that? And is there an actual pushback from libraries to publishers in the future? And we've seen, of course, some examples here of Amazon. And Amazon, of course, to some degree is threatening libraries, but also making the promise of creating new readers. And so that's, we don't know how that's going to play out as well. And I think this is very interesting. This is from IDW, which some of you may know is a comic book publisher. That's not how they started out life. They were actually created posters for movie companies. But they are now, when we talk about negotiating with publishers, they have decided to break the model, and they now do all-up production. So this is one of their new properties, V-Wars, where it's a novel. It is a comic book series. They are producing the television show, and they are creating games off the same property, all under their label. So what used to happen would be, if you wrote a novel, you would then say, I'm going to license this to IDW, and they'll do the comic book. I'm going to license this to Broderbund, and they're going to do the video game. And I'm going to license this to Hasbro, and they'll do the board game version, if they did that at all. And then there was all the electronic distribution. IDW said, forget all of that. We're doing it all in-house, and we're doing it all ourselves. So I think there's a very interesting movement here that, again, we don't know how that's going to play out in the future. The relationship with devices, are we going to facilitate and own those, or are we going to lend them to people? I think this is, as we transition to electronic media, it's a big question for libraries of where do you make that investment? Are you going to actually have Kindles that you give to people and check out, or are you going to encourage people? Are you going to work with Amazon to have a fund that allows people to buy Kindles at a lower price? How's that going to work? And I think there's an analog that's happened in the past, which is, I've seen libraries with rows and rows and rows of books on MP3 player where the publishers sold you a little bit of a bill of goods. They were working under uncertainty, you were working under uncertainty, and they said, we're going to put these books on MP3 players, and people will be able to check the MP3 player out, and they'll be able to listen to the audiobook. And now those are pretty much sitting there because most people have their own smart devices with their own audio capabilities, and they don't need the device anymore, and the device actually is a liability rather than an advantage. And so why is the tablet or the smartphone or the iPod any different than those? And we have to really understand where those investments are going. Are we going to think about the world? And so this is much bigger than libraries. I did some work with the Building Schools of the Future program in the UK. And one of the big questions there was, how do we actually organize learning? And so are we going to fragment it where every person in higher education or secondary education and elsewhere are creating their own subjects, and they're not really coordinated, and you take calculus in one place and you do something, and you take history in another, and they have a completely different agenda? Or, as we did with the Building Schools of the Future program, what they did was they brought together if we're teaching World War II, we are teaching in science, we're teaching radar. In math, we're teaching cryptography. We're teaching the history of World War II, the literature of World War II, and so all of the classes are coordinated around a time period or some other organizing principle. And so, that again, begs the question of how we actually organize and how we teach, and I think there's an impact there on what libraries do. What will be the role of place? And so we already mentioned third place and other things. Does place actually matter? And so, I was in the Central Library in New York City not too long ago, and outside of the gift shop on the first floor, it took me a while wandering around to actually find a book in the library in New York. It's very quick for me to find a book online and sometimes even interact with somebody. I know a few authors, and I can actually sometimes get to an author quicker than I can get to their book. And so what is that role of place, and do we need as many physical libraries, and does the role of the library and what they get hired for change, and does it become more virtualized? Is the world going to be global, or is it going to be fractured, as this shows with the various regional commands of the U.S. military, or does it become global? And so this is, again, another very big one that I put in because there are these struggles against globalization and the propensity that most people think of globalization is inevitable. It is not, and there are forces pulling against it, and that will change how we think about global and national issues. And of course, we've got examples here of the rise of the Chinese military. Everybody's very familiar from last year what's happening in the Ukraine and with Russia. And then we have Thomas Friedman, who acts as a futurist because he made a declarative statement of the world is flat. The world is not flat. I would write a book called The World is a Big Fat Lumpy Mess. I think we have to, again, take some of these positions of people who are saying that we've, the deity of your choice is called, and here's the answer, and I've now written it down for you, and really think about these as much more complex issues. Is education, and this is for my future of work, is education going to be irrelevant and subsistent, or is it going to be influential and leading, meaning from the state of the United States in this particular case, and the United States going to decide that they're going to invest in education in a way that it is a strategic asset to the nation, or are we going to, for the public side of it, say, we're going to continue to cut budgets, and educators are not as much first-class citizens as they should be in the economic sense. What happens with millennials who are learning just in time and are learning what their organization tells them? How do we think about these learners and what their relationship is with libraries and the learning models that they bring with them? And then, this was an interesting article recently of virtual reality technology expands the visual into a physical experience. So going into, again, I'm seeing libraries being asked to be the 3D printer hub of the world. I'm not sure that's the right thing, right? Because every new technology, I'm not sure it gets filtered through of the, is that a new charter for a library? And here's another potential of the, does the library computer bank shift from being, eventually from being just terminals to, does it become the 3D hub, right? Because it's a new technology. And I think there's a slippery slope there for strategic choices about every new technology before it becomes something that consumers can have, we're going to bring it to the library. And I think, again, that's an investment question, which brings up strategy. One of the most interesting questions that I have is around the idea of curiosity, and I think that's a very broad and very open uncertainty. And so if you think about the wealth of information on the internet, I can decide that I'm going to be a tennis player, and I'm going to go on, and there are literally almost lifetimes of information uploaded every day. So in all of that, there's more than I can consume as a student of tennis than I will ever be able to consume. And the same is true of science fiction. I could go delve into science fiction, and there's more stuff about science fiction and opinions on science fiction and old movies and comic books and all kinds of other things every single day, and I could never be ahead of it, and so I could steep myself in that. Is it going to be narrowcast to the point that that's what we do, or are we going to broadcast? Are learners going to decide that I'm going to dabble in tennis, I'm going to dabble in science fiction, I'm going to dabble in photography, I'm going to dabble in playing the piano, I'm going to dabble in this, I'm going to be a Renaissance person, because the other side of the internet is there's so much information that I could actually get engaged and do something on anything that I wanted to. And again, uncertainty. We don't know how people are going to do that, and if they're split, what the percentages are going to be. And again, those raise questions about what is the role of the library in either of those worlds. Is technology going to be external? Some people will tell you we're putting in contact lens and things will be read to you right to your eye, and they'll and when you blink, that'll be your checkout of the book. All the infrastructure that you've put in for barcode readers and all that other stuff will disappear. You'll have personal technology on you. There'll be personal technology embedded in the book, and when you walk out of the library, you'll just blink at the window, and that'll say, this book in my hand is mine for 2 weeks, and I walk out. Right? Or do we get to the point of embedding, which is I don't have to go to the library because it's all just in my head, right? And so we're actually seeing that there are technologies of putting things into kind of the cybernetic side of the world, and again, we don't know. And these are pretty rapid. When we're talking about 10-year time horizons, I would not be surprised if we were having huge debates about computer implants over the next decade. Censorship is another huge issue. An interesting question comes into the digital realm. If I own a digital book and I'm in a place in the world or a time in the world, because the United States has certainly had book burnings and censorship and book bannings and other things, and in some places in the United States that certainly continues in the world. But let's say that one of the publishers decides that, okay, if people are offended by this, I'm going to go in and change the author's words and fix that and make it less offensive. And the next time I download the book, I'm not offended, but I don't even know what happened, right? So that interaction of the digital side, I can't do that with a physical book, right? That's why there were book burnings. We can't get rid of this offensive thing, so we have to actually destroy it. In the digital realm, I can have somebody go in and say, for all copies of this that are on the internet, go change this and propagate a new version of it out and treat it like an error correction, right? And so I think we have to be very careful with how that goes. And then we have digital rights management or digital restriction management, as many people think about it. DRM on books and other pieces of content. What does it mean? One of my pet peeves is how many times, for instance, I have purchased Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band or a copy of Star Wars the movie, right? So I have it on VHS, I have it on high-definition VHS with Dolby, I have it on Laserdisc, I have it on DVD, I have it on Blu-ray, and so, Lucas and Disney have made lots of money off of me buying the same thing over and over. Is that something that's still true in the digital rights management? What happens if Amazon or Apple are not the end-all, be-all of our digital electronic world, and somewhere in the future one of them disappears or is acquired? What happens to our digital rights and the things that we've acquired? As well as distribution, right? So when we think about Chris Anderson and thinking about things being free, that's another issue. What will we need to know? I've done some research. Hopefully this will work over the web. We'll see. That's a big question. What books what knowledge do I have to have in order to give it to people? And it's a big question in industry. It's a big question in higher education about what classes do we teach. And so futurists will tell you that 90% of the jobs people will hold 10 years from now don't exist today. And I say, well, we can probably do a little bit better than that. And so here's a list of some of the jobs that I think will potentially be around in 10 years. So there's a whole set of things from asteroid miner. We have a company here in Bellevue, Washington that is getting into asteroid mining. We've got space tour guides. As we move forward into space tourism, somebody's going to have to look out the window and go, over there is Mars. And a lot of things that are combinations, right? So computers and/or robotics and other things, right? So robot builders and tenders, people who take care of robots and mechanics, brain analysts, so people who are using computers to analyze what's happening with brains, but also some very human things, right? Very, very human things. Animal guardians, where you're taking care of endangered species, drowned city specialists, and then some also very weird things, right? Authenticity engineer, because people want to have websites that feel authentic, and so you hire an engineer to create a false sense of authenticity on your website. And so lots and lots of different things that we could see going forward. Okay, there we go. And so some of the work that I do is actually looking at new scientists, for instance. I find these different articles that suggest a commercialization going forward, and then I build a model of what would that industry look like. And so this is an example of the top one. Bio-inspired speaker uses clear gel to play music. So you put this gel in between two panes of glass and your windows become speakers. So you need gel repair people and smart screens and Windows designers and gel speaker assembly and saline purification and all these other things related to that. And then you can go through a process, and I've had some recent discussions with some researchers of trying to make this a scalable thing, where you can then take one of these things, take the gel speakers, and ask, was there follow-on research? Did the company get founded? Did they get funding? Were there legal disputes? Were patents filed? Were product announcements made? Were products released? And then go from the idea of, we have some hype, we have this hint that something could be in the future, but we don't have time to pay attention to it. And I think there are ways that we can pay attention to that and help answer those questions about what the jobs of the future are going to be. Now, big data and analytics are on everybody's top 10 things I have to think about in 2015. And we have to ask the question, are they going to be insightful and oppressive? Are we going to use them to analyze things about people that constrains their creativity, constrains their lives? Or are we going to open up and be insightful and empowering to where we're suggesting things to people that are meaningful and fulfilling and add value? I use an example in the workplace of, I could have a conversation with somebody around, you cancel meetings all the time, and here's all the analytics about how much you're costing us, and, we're really tired of this, and this is a terrible thing that you do. Not that I'm condoning it in any measure, but, that's, the tone of that conversation about the data showing just how bad something is, or the insightful side of the, this is a great project you're working on, and we found a couple people, one in Belgium and one in Brazil, and there's another guy in Portugal as well, that are kind of interested in the same stuff, and we found some time on their schedule, and we're suggesting that we have a meeting where you guys can talk to each other and get to know each other, because we think that both you and the organization would benefit from that synergy, right? And so that's a different side of analytics and a much more positive use. Not, again, that they're mutually exclusive, but we're showing the extremes when we're talking about uncertainty. So scenario planning is what I do in terms of helping people think about the future, where we go through this process of thinking about multiple futures, taking the uncertainties, writing different stories about the future so that we can avoid surprises, prepare for adaptation. So if we practice and we thought about something, it's not going to be as much of a surprise. We may not have to change as much if we've already started thinking about how we would react to something. One of the biggest things is challenging prevailing assumptions. So if you go back to the original story of people writing these myths about the future, organizations can get those codified. They can say, we went through this process and so thought about this this future, and here's our codified vision of the future of the library, and that's our story, and we're sticking to it. We don't care what happens. It's 10 years in the future. There's a lot of stuff that's going to happen between now and then. We're sticking to this story. Strategically, what I suggest to organizations is that they don't do that, that they create multiple stories so they can get into the different perspectives that the world could unfold in, and that helps them be more robust and resilient. It's not that you don't have the future. and your aspirations toward the future, but you have a realistic sense of if we don't get there, what do we have to change? How do we navigate through that? Something that you may say we're going to hit in 10 years, you say, well, that's really not realistic. As we get closer to the end, that's really a 15-year goal, not a 10-year goal. And you modify things to reflect the reality of the world. And scenario planning, as I said, is outside in. It's about the world that you don't control. So when we talked about globalization, when we talked about the the issues of censorship, those are things that are not library specific. You may at some point get a call and say, you have to take this book off the shelf. That would be a local censorship thing. But the propensity of, do we have a culture of censorship? Is the government involved? Is it a community-wide, nationwide, global phenomenon? That's something outside of your control. It's bigger, and if that happens, it will have influence on things that happen locally. And then we use as a shorthand STEEP. It's called social, technological, economic, environmental, and political. And those are the categories of uncertainty. And the whole point of this is that all of this stuff that I've mentioned today, most of you probably are aware of it. You've seen it. You haven't necessarily recognized it as an uncertainty and something that you have to grapple with on a day-to-day basis. And so I go with Schopenhauer here of the task is not so much to see what no one has yet seen, but to think what nobody has yet thought about that which everyone sees. And so a couple other uncertainties: how do we measure success? Do we see everything as a factory? And I think there's a propensity in the technology of libraries to look at, kind of check-in and check-out technology, and how do we eliminate the transactions at the desk. I actually learned a lot as a kid from the transactions at the desk and having a conversation with somebody. And I know we're all about efficiency, and that's kind of where this goes, is it all about efficiency, or is there a measure of value back into the community of having that interaction at the end that's not just a transaction, it's a get to know the customer, it's an engage with the customer, ask the question that was left unanswered by just wandering around the library, right? And so do we actually put a value on serendipity? And then yes?
Just wanted to let you know we have about 11 minutes left.
Okay.
Thank you.
I will get through it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And so then we have the black swans, which are big, unanticipated, or things we can imagine that happen very infrequently, but when they do happen, they're very big, and they have lots of impact on the world. And so those are things that should be kept on the back burner as well, and people should be aware of. And so we go into these scenarios where we have multiple futures, and there are 4 that I have here that are represented by the uncertainties of, is learning motivation going to be the state or the corporation deciding what it is that you learn? And so when we think about STEM education, the U.S. government, Department of Education, many large businesses have said we have to do STEM, right? And I always feel bad for journalist students and ballet dancers when they're told that calculus is something that's going to save their life, when it may be journalism or ballet that saves our lives, right? Or is it internal? Is it something that people are doing? That's the other side, is that I get the opportunity to decide what's right for me. Is the learning approach going to be fragmented? Are we going to have this, everything is available and we'll just teach whatever we teach? Or are we going to actually start making sense and creating collections of knowledge? And so we end up with these 4 different worlds, and I'll go through them very, very briefly. Corporate lifeline, a world of public-private partnerships. Your career is determined by early corporate education partners. The U.S. remains dominant, and people live to work and work to live. So that's the shorthand that we use when we're having a conversation about an idea, a concept, when we're challenging an assumption. We put it into these different futures and say, how would this idea play out in that future? And we can get much more robust. We can go in and look at the social, technological, economic, environmental, and political sides of that world. And then we can also see that, because in scenario planning we're at the center of the scenario, all of these futures are unfolding at the same time, and here are examples of real things that happen in the real world that point toward that future but don't negate the other futures. So all of these futures are happening at the same time, and when you think about resilience and moving forward, apologies for the telephone. When you think about the way forward, it is complex, it is messy. All of these futures happen, none of them happen, but if you're only thinking about a particular future, then you end up missing all of this information. Time out is a world in which globalization is fractured. Countries and regions are turning inward to shore up their own societies. National and state control predominates. And then here's examples of that as well, of things that are unfolding. And then the social, economic, political view of that future, nationalistic, repatriation, etc. Subprime learning, deep financial crisis, old rules have stopped working, networks are managed, so this is a retrenchment from technology, a move toward tribalization, and a loud call for a U.S. Constitutional Convention. And again, we go through the various aspects of this future. And in a workshop, we would actually work through these, and I'll show you an example of that just before we get done with this. Open learning, a world of large corporations that have become holding companies, and this is really the world the millennials are taking us kicking and screaming into. This is the future that is one of high networked, kind of disambiguity in terms of the work that you do is for yourself and you're a contractor to the organization, and so it's a very networked, very futuristic world where a lot of technology is helping you make sense of things. And again, we go through those various aspects and see some very, very key things around both technology as well as social issues that point toward that future being potential. Now, when we think about libraries and we think about buildings, there's structure, right? It's concrete and it's steel, and we say, well, Dan, those are all great. All those scenarios are interesting things, and the idea and the concept of something like what could a librarian be is malleable, and we can think about different job descriptions. But buildings are buildings, and I bring in Stuart Brand and how buildings learn, because he applies scenarios, and we've actually see over the course of time buildings learn over their lifetime and change and become different things. And so we have to think about, we can, I think, give ourselves permission to think about the physical spaces as being somewhat as malleable in terms of purpose as the more abstract and less concrete things. So implications is that I asked the question about what would a book look like in the future, and so we did this workshop where we looked at the book under various futures. So the futures you just had here, books are on paper, they're digital, commercially constrained representations of books versus open interoperability, and we created this new view of a book, right, and added some attributes of things like being able to get to the authors and being able to keep your notes even if you resell a book, and being able to resell an electronic book, socially share an idea, buying a book and having the access to the author is an add-on to the book, and if you add on even a few more dollars, you can have access to the people that the author quoted in the book who happen, those who are still alive, right? And so there's all these different models, and I think we're just at the very, very front end of the what can we do with a digital book, and we need to, continue to not think that the book as it is today or the electronic version of the book as it is today is the end-all be-all. There's a lot of uncertainty even in the basic technologies that we go forward. And we do all of this because we have to plan for the future that we want, not just the one we want, but the one that we are given. And I'm going to skip, this is my other book, Management by Design. Think about the experiences that you have for employees in your libraries as well. That's what this book is about. And I'm going to pause and say thank you very much. And hopefully there were some tweets out there, and if not, there's my Twitter handle, and feel free to tweet anything. And let's see if we got a couple questions here before the end.
Thank you, Dan. Whew. I'm tired. You got a lot in there.
It's a lot of stuff.
It's a lot of stuff, and I want to remind everybody your slides are available. We are recording this, so they can all go back and look if they missed something. Here's a question for you from Rebecca. Librarians feel often we are just helplessly responding to whatever innovations come from the tech and business worlds, and then we're forced to adapt. So how can we be more a part of the discussion about what to innovate and keeping all human needs in mind? Where do we go?
Well, I think that the libraries, and that's where I go back to the consortium idea, because I work with various states, and there's a few consortium, and some of them are focused on interlibrary loans or some other thing. I think that there's a lack of political will kind of in the library movement, and I think that's something that the libraries have to have a conversation nationally about. how do we assert ourselves better politically? There's a little bit of lobbying maybe that goes on, but it's certainly not the same kind of thing that happens with technology companies, and it's not proactive when it comes to the technology companies, right? So there's not the libraries asking Microsoft to come in and telling Microsoft about the vision the libraries have created about the future versus inviting Microsoft to come in and saying, show us what your new book thing is, right? And we know, Microsoft's a great example because Microsoft had a ebook platform long before Amazon did that they then abandoned after getting people to start using it and getting publishers to put books on it, right? So I think there's a strategic dialogue that needs to happen in the marketplace of libraries about how do we come together, how do we create a sense of political of heft that people are paying attention rather than assuming that we're just going to do whatever. And I think that goes to how we publish, how technology is adopted, and all those things. And I think that workshop I did, there was a lot of energy, and I've actually reached out to Amazon to share that, and Amazon, at least to the contacts at fairly high levels, have not been interested in having me share what librarians think the future of the book could look like.
Great. We have time for one more question, and that is, this is quite a list, lots to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Some of this is really exciting, some is a little scary, but it's good for us to hear. So what is your advice for how we best prepare for all of this?
Well, that's where the scenario stuff comes in, and it's really also just paying attention and making sure that you acknowledge it, right? So the propensity is that, I'll give this talk tomorrow, you go back to your library and go, that was a lot of stuff, I don't have time to think about that, I have to go do whatever it is my job is, right? And so, again, getting to the point that libraries are thinking more strategically. And this is not just for libraries. I have these conversations with pharmaceutical companies and banks and government organizations, right? So it's really taking that action of thinking strategically and understanding when you're making a decision about where's the new library, what are we investing in, what books do we have, what technology do we buy, of thinking about it in those terms of uncertainty. And maybe you wouldn't have shelves of books on MP3 player today if people had thought about that's the technology, it's probably pretty short-lived, right? That it's really grappling with it, and that's where the scenario stuff comes in, is it really helps people raise above the day-to-day and think about it and think about the business of libraries as being something that it's okay to be strategic. It's not all tactical and reactive, that you can't have a strategic point of view.
Great. So with that, and you've done a lot of consulting with libraries, what do you see as the most exciting thing happening in libraries right now?
That's a very good question. I think I think having these conversations is actually exciting to me because I think there's this undertone of we're not going to just sit here and let the world come at us anymore, and we have to have this conversation. Unfortunately, I see it in a fragmented way because, I haven't been yet to the, hopefully at some point I can do a workshop or something at the national level. So I see it state by state, county by county, university system by university system, and I think it would be great if that, if we could come together with a bigger dialogue. I've had some conversation. There is the libraries group in the U.S. government, and I've reached out to them, but there's been a little bit of pushback of we're thinking about libraries strategically, and again, I'm not sure if the libraries are actually driving that, the government's driving that, or who's doing that. So, I think it's something that it excites me that we can have these conversations and that I'm invited in to help jog the thinking, and would love to see more of that in a more consolidated way.
Great. Thank you so much. It's actually a question I've asked all the presenters, and it's unique. It's interesting to hear the different ones. Thank you so much, Daniel, for all the information and the great presentation. Thank you all for listening in. Our next session is up at 2:30. Crystal will be talking about 6 essential skills for one-on-one tech instruction. Again, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everybody. Hope to see you at the next 2 sessions. So long.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.